Japanese call it gaman, enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. For those who lived and suffered through a dark chapter in America's past, that virtue was put to the test. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. America entered World War II.
Okay, let's go.
That one event changed the course of millions of lives. And for Saburo Masada of Fresno, California, it has led him here. To a wind-swept field in southern Arkansas, to a place where he was imprisoned as a boy, not for any crime he had committed, but because he was born with Japanese blood in his veins. Nearly 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most American citizens, were imprisoned against their will by the United States government after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Nearly all of them went peacefully and did not resist, even though their constitutional rights were stripped away. They were shamed and they suffered, but they endured the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. Gaman. Now the time has come to speak out, to rewalk the path, to try and understand how this happened, and to heal. History isn't always a collection of events that we are proud of. Understanding our mistakes so that we don't repeat them is how we honor the journey we've all made together.
Funding for Silent Sacrifice was made possible by grants from Japanese American Confinement Sites Program of the National Park Service and California Civil Liberties Public Education Program. Major production funding provided by the Larry and Alice Kitahara Foundation, Nisei Farmers League, Sun-Made Growers of California.
It's a wonderful feeling to be a raisin grower because that's what I grew up with. For our family, Sun-Made provided a very safe haven to market our raisins after the war. I will be a Sun-Made member until the day I die.
As well as through the generous support of these individual and business donors. Thank you.
Saab and his wife Marion are far from home. In their late 80s, they've come from Fresno, California, to visit southern Arkansas and reconnect with the painful past. 12 years old, Saab became a prisoner of the United States government after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor during World War II. He wasn't an enemy soldier or spy. He was an American, a legal U.S. citizen taken from his school, his friends, his home, and everything he knew growing up in California's Central Valley, to be brought 1,400 miles across the country and put behind barbed wire. Saab and Marion, like so many affected by this dark chapter in our country's history, have a story to tell. A story that has taken a lifetime to write, a lifetime to understand, and one with the lesson that must be passed on. To undo a mistake is always more difficult than to not create one originally. Our great nation made a mistake in a time of war that has affected generations of Japanese Americans. Saab and Marion's journey here is their way of helping us all understand what happened, how it happened, so that it doesn't happen again. California's San Joaquin Valley is a sprawling expanse of agricultural fields where most of America's food is grown. It's a cross-stitching of crops, large cities, small towns, and a diversity of people that have always made this place as rich as its soil. But this sentiment didn't always exist. The Japanese-American experience in World War II here was foreshadowed by a storm of anti-Asian hate that grew in the West as Japanese immigrants sought a better life in the United States. This discrimination began with Chinese immigrants after the California Gold Rush in 1849. As more whites settled in the West, competition for jobs with Chinese immigrants created economic grievances that led to an overall prejudice against Asians. By 1905, widespread Japanese immigration brought with it widespread discrimination, and here, in the fertile fields of California's Central Valley, where the success of Japanese farmers grew rapidly, resentment fueled the growing hate. Japanese immigrants were called Issei from the combination of Japanese words for one and generation. Their children, the American-born second generation, are Nisei, and the third generation are called Sansei. The Issei who settled in Central California were mostly from the Japanese countryside, so working the land was second nature for them. Their lives and the lives of their children were forever changed as a result of World War II and their wrongful imprisonment. Generations of silence about what happened is now beginning to break. Their time to speak out has come. These are their stories.
My grandfather, Hisataro Nakagawa, came from Hiroshima, Japan, to the big island of Hawaii in a little village called Ola'a. And his goal was to always come to the mainland and the land of opportunity here in this valley to start a farm, a grape farm. So when my grandfather came here in 1886 to this valley, he was one of the first wave of Hawaiians to or Japanese Americans to come from Japan, or Issei to come from Japan to the mainland. And he had an edge. He knew the loopholes of the laws. There were so many discriminatory laws for Japanese coming over for the Issei.
In 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law, making the ownership of agricultural land impossible for Issei immigrants, since they now would be considered aliens, ineligible for legal citizenship. In 1920, the even stronger Alien Land Act prevented Issei farmers from leasing land or sharecropping.
So with the Alien Land Law, Since he couldn't purchase it as an Issei, he knew the loophole. He says, okay, well, you won't let me buy the land, then I'm going to put it under my kids' names, my father and my Uncle Johnny, who was actually born in Ola'a. My dad was born in 1905 here in Bowles, or what we call today Carruthers. So that's what these Issei immigrants were facing, discriminatory laws, the xenophobia of being a foreign person, coming from a foreign place. But for him, it was, his thing was always love America for its promise, not for its practice.
While discrimination and racism against Japanese spread through the West prior to World War II, its effects weren't always felt or seen. Many Japanese families worked small plots of land across the San Joaquin Valley, and often Japanese parents shielded their Nisei children from the truth.
Just before the war, we bought our first farm, and that address was Carruthers. We didn't have any electricity or running water. We had a pump, a hand pump that we pumped our water, and outhouse, and no electricity. But I grew up just a real happy childhood.
Well, the Japanese community in Livingston was actually fairly strong. I mean, the community was fairly clandestine. They kept to themselves. The Kaji family tended to be a little bit more social with the Caucasian community. Primarily, I think, because my grandfather spoke fairly fluent in English, and so he did a lot of business with the Caucasian community. A lot of the Japanese residents here, they didn't speak much English. It was more difficult for them to socialize and or do business with the outside world. But in our family's case, you know, my grandfather, who spoke English very well, he did business. He was very social. He rubbed shoulders with a lot of the Caucasian people who were in business here.
The Japanese, in some ways, has to be seen against a mosaic of different ethnic groups in the valley. There were the Chinese, who in the past had been seen as an unwelcome presence as well. Fresno has a large population of Armenians. At this time, many people actually saw the Armenians as being unwelcome. They even had the somewhat derogatory term, the Fresno Indians, that were leveled at the Armenians. And this was because many people in the valley were involved in agriculture, and they were tied to the cooperatives. The Armenians oftentimes were seen as being independent. They didn't actually cooperate in getting the same price for their produce, that they sold independently. And so the packers sometimes felt unhappy about this independent streak on the part of the Armenians. They weren't seen as cooperative. The Japanese, who were very sensitive to how they were perceived in the valley, tended to see what other people were doing. They joined the cooperatives. They did the things that the cooperatives wanted. And as a result, they actually felt that they had knitted themselves into the fabric of the valley.
If you went back in history of the Japanese Americans who came here, they worked very hard, and they were very successful. They were very successful before World War II, and they actually started owning a lot of their own farms in California, and some of the other people did not like the fact that Japanese were so successful in the farms. So when the war started, it gave them a good excuse to get them out of here.
So now we're into the early 1930s. Japantown/Chinatown here in Fresno was a vibrant part of Fresno. It had bathhouses, hotels, movie houses, bookstores. My grandmother had a restaurant called Matsuno Zushi right on Kern and E. And across the street, my grandfather had a general store. So it really was a very vibrant time for our family to have a farm, a 20-acre grape farm on my father's side, and then on my mother's side to have my bachan or my grandmother have this very vibrant restaurant, and across the street my grandfather having the general store. My grandmother was a very progressive woman. She would greet her customers with sitting at the front counter with a long stem cigarette holder with a cigarette. And I say progressive because not many women were smoking in the 30s. I mean, it was very taboo for any woman to smoke. But it was a great time in the 30s in Fresno, especially in the Japantown and Chinatown.
World War II began on September 1st, 1939. While it was a complex battle globally, there were two distinct sides. The Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan battled the Allied powers of the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, China, and eventually the United States. The Empire of Japan was seen as an aggressive force to leaders in America even before World War II began. The Japanese victory over Russia and the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 was the first defeat of a Western nation by an Asian nation in modern times. When Japan invaded China in 1937 and then formed an alliance with Nazi Germany and Italy in World War II, the United States was watching. The Empire of Japan was on a mission to reunify Asian countries and expand its dominance around the world. They were seen by most countries as a serious threat. The Alien Registration Act of 1940 required all people the U.S. government saw as aliens over the age of 14 to be registered and fingerprinted, and shortly after, the FBI began a list identifying German, Italian, and Japanese individuals they thought could be dangerous if America formally engaged in the war. As tensions rose and the threat of conflict with Japan escalated, the Japanese Nisei living on the West Coast saw what might come if Japan attacked their country. Fears of retribution, imprisonment, and even execution were real, so the decision to show loyalty to America led to the formation of the Japanese American Citizens League. The JACL became a strong, patriotic voice for those of Japanese ancestry in California's Central Valley.
The 1940s, an interesting transition had taken place in the Japanese community. In 1920, 73% of the Japanese community was foreign-born. By 1940, in the 1940 census, 37% only was foreign-born. That meant that the Issei, who are the foreign-born portion of the Japanese population, the first generation, had now been actually eclipsed by a growing and much larger second generation, a generation born in the United States, the Nisei.
In the late summer of 1941, life in Fresno, California was good. While eyes were on Hitler's advances in Europe and the expanding aggressions of Japan, everyday life continued as usual in the city and agricultural countryside. In October of '41, the big Fresno Fair drew record crowds as it still does today. Parking lots filled, families enjoying the long, late summer days, unaware that in less than 2 months their country would be at war. On November 7th, exactly 1 month before the Pearl Harbor attack, Curtis B. Munson's report on the West Coast Japanese Americans landed on President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's desk. Munson was a successful businessman who was commissioned by the State Department to investigate the reaction of people of Japanese ancestry, legal citizens or not, if Japan attacked the United States. Munson's report concluded that most of the West Coast Japanese were loyal to America, and a widespread uprising or revolt was highly unlikely. U.S. Army intelligence wrote their assessment of the Munson report shortly after it was submitted to the President. The Army agreed with Munson's findings and stated that identification of potentially dangerous Japanese on the West Coast was complete, and that sabotage by the general Japanese American population on the West Coast was not expected. That Army intelligence report never made it to the President's desk. The Japanese military had begun making plans to attack the United States in early 1941, even as the Japanese government was in active negotiations with America to prevent war. Japanese war planners thought a preemptive strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor would limit the ability of the United States to interfere with Japan's ambitions to take over British colonies in Southeast Asia, Singapore, and the Philippines. On November 26, 1941, a naval strike force of 6 aircraft carriers left Japan and headed towards the Hawaiian Islands. Diplomatic negotiations between Japan and the United States were deteriorating. We now know those negotiations were never intended by the Japanese to succeed. They were part of a distraction effort to move the carrier strike group into position and attack with full surprise before any formal declaration of war was made. Early in the morning of December 7th, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft launched from the carriers in 2 waves. They headed for the island of Oahu, their target, the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. For an hour and a half, death rained down on American forces and civilians at Pearl Harbor, the sounds of war shattering the quiet of a peaceful Sunday morning. When the attack ended, 2,403 Americans were killed. Nearly 1,200 were severely injured, and the Pacific Fleet was left burning. America declared war on Japan and officially entered World War II. And for 120,000 Japanese immigrants and Americans living on the west coast of the United States, life was about to change.
That was an early Sunday morning, and you know, I'm a tennis player from way back, and I played on the high school tennis team. And this is early Sunday morning. It's about 7 o'clock, 7:30 on Sunday morning. And as we were playing tennis, a car stopped by the side of the road in Livingston at the high school, and there were about 3 men in the car, and they got out and started to curse at us and called us all kinds of names and made it very uncomfortable. So we left, and when we got home, listening to the radio, we found out that Pearl Harbor had happened. And that's how we first became acquainted with what was happening.
And I distinctly remember saying, what a stupid thing Japan is doing. Who do they think they are, bombing our country? And about a couple of weeks later, I began to hear rumors that we were partly responsible because we were accused of not being loyal to America, and the rumors were going around that we should all be rounded up and put into a concentration camp.
We didn't have much of a TV then, I guess, but I remember reading it. It just didn't seem possible something like that happened, but it did.
There was a lot of talk before Pearl Harbor. The media was playing up with all the anti-Japanese sentiment. There was a lot of propaganda. People were starting to have some sentiment that was anti-Japanese, but it wasn't until after the bombing that things got really ugly.
I didn't know about it until I went to school the next morning. And then things were so weird. My friends weren't talking to me. My classmates weren't talking to me, and they pretended that they didn't even see me walking down the hallway. And I thought, now what did I do that changed things so much?
The shock of a sneak attack on American soil caused widespread hysteria and paranoia across the country. These fears were amplified when Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy in Roosevelt's administration, blamed Pearl Harbor on a wildly successful espionage effort by Japan, instead of the more damaging truth that the local military in Hawaii was ill-prepared for exactly what happened. This exaggeration helped the American people maintain confidence in the Navy, but fueled sensational news reports and stories of sabotage and imminent invasion by Japan that were simply untrue. Military leaders here and in Japan had already crunched the numbers and had come to the conclusion that a full-scale invasion by either country wasn't feasible. Findings that were never shared with the public. War hysteria and anti-Japanese sentiment was made worse by several events that happened directly after the Pearl Harbor attack. On December 7, 1941, a single Japanese warplane, damaged by U.S. ground fire in the Pearl Harbor attack, crash-landed in a field on the relatively unknown Hawaiian island of Niihau, west of Kauai. The pilot survived and was taken in by several Japanese people that lived on the remote island amongst the native Hawaiians. A few days later, when villagers learned of the attack on Pearl Harbor by radio, it was decided to turn the pilot over to the military on nearby Kauai. But by then, the pilot had convinced his Japanese hosts to aid him in getting his gun and papers back so he could escape to a submarine that would pick him up and return him to the fleet. A fight broke out between the two parties. A local Hawaiian named Ben Kanahili and his wife Ella fought the Japanese pilot as he scrambled for a gun. When it was over, the pilot was dead, but not before Kanahili suffered 3 gunshot wounds that almost ended his life. One of the Japanese residents that had come so quickly to the aid of the pilot committed suicide on the spot. News of the Niihau incident reached Washington, D.C., and fanned the flames of hate that were growing against the Japanese American population. If one downed pilot could turn 3 Japanese Americans against the United States in a matter of hours, how many more plots to strike America from within were out there? One of the main figures in the confusion and fear that swept America after the Pearl Harbor attack was Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, the commander of the Western Defense Command and U.S. Fourth Army. DeWitt had a well-established reputation of prejudice against non-Caucasian Americans and was easily influenced by any rumor of sabotage or imminent Japanese invasion.
He was a person who felt that something had to be done with the Japanese aliens. He actually vacillated a number of times, but in the end, listening to subordinates like Alan Gullion, the subordinate Carl Bennetson, who dealt with enemy aliens under Alan Gullion, John L. DeWitt came to the idea that it should be the case that the Japanese on the West Coast should be removed and taken away from the West Coast.
Initially, DeWitt was against the idea of a broad-scale removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. On December 19, 1941, General DeWitt recommended that only people over the age of 14 from enemy nations be removed and held by restraint in the interior of the country.
After the disaster in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, heads would roll. An angry Congress and irate public demanded action. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel was in charge of the naval forces and the overall military situation in Hawaii, was actually removed from command. The second in command, who was in charge of the Army, General Walter Short, he himself was also removed from command. So the result was that he could see what would happen if he was actually less than vigilant in carrying out some sort of defensive policy for the West Coast.
On January 21, 1942, DeWitt recommended to Secretary of War Henry Stimson the creation of small, prohibited zones around strategic areas in California from which so-called enemy aliens and their native-born children would be removed. Stimson and Attorney General Francis Biddle agreed with the plan as long as Japanese Americans' constitutional rights were not violated. However, on February 9th, DeWitt asked for much larger prohibited zones in Washington State and Oregon, including the entire cities of Seattle, Portland, and Tacoma. Attorney General Biddle refused to okay the plan, but President Roosevelt, convinced of the military necessity of DeWitt's recommendation, bypassed the Justice Department and gave the Army carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. 2 days later, DeWitt submitted his final plan, calling for the removal of all Japanese, including native-born U.S. citizens and other subversive persons from the entire area lying west of the Sierra Nevada and Cascade Mountain ranges. DeWitt justified this broad-scale removal as military necessity, stating that the Japanese race is an enemy race and the fact that no such sabotage had yet taken place was a disturbing indication that such action will be taken. While the military debated the restrictions on Japanese Americans, public opinion on the West Coast was growing for confining all persons of Japanese ancestry. At the same time, the Japanese American Citizens League was active in demonstrating its loyalty to America by becoming air raid wardens and joining the Army. Nevertheless, the anti-Japanese American sentiment in the media was vicious. A Los Angeles Times editorial in early 1942 echoed the feelings of many. A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents will grow up to be a Japanese, not an American.
Well, you know, there was tremendous propaganda that went on at this time. All the newspapers, there were articles in the magazines, and different city councils were anti-Japanese, and so there was a lot of anti-Japanese feelings going on at the time.
The historians who have studied this process don't know exactly what were the immediate motivations of Franklin Roosevelt. There are no records, oral records, as to how Franklin Roosevelt dealt with this decision. We just know that he decided in favor of the removal of the Japanese. And on February 19th, 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066.
Executive Order 9066 gave full control of the fate of 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast to General John DeWitt. The order allowed DeWitt to designate military zones in Washington, Oregon, California, and Arizona. The constitutional rights of these American citizens were suspended and control over their lives given to the military. Never before in our history as a nation had this happened. Confusion and misinformation spread after DeWitt created Zones 1 and 2 on the West Coast with different standards about who could stay in these areas and who had to leave. Original plans for Executive Order 9066 were intended to remove all so-called enemy aliens, which meant the Japanese, German, and Italian populations, since these were the Axis countries the world was at war with. But public opinion was strongly against the removal of German and Italian aliens, leaving the Japanese as the main focus of the effort. By March of 1942, the decision was made to remove all people of Japanese ancestry, including US-born legal citizens, out of the 2 prohibited zones set forth by General DeWitt. The plan was to create 2 phases of the internment process. First, all Japanese were ordered to report to what the military called assembly centers, detention centers typically in makeshift barracks located at local fairgrounds, while the actual war relocation centers, located in the interior of the United States, were being rapidly built.
Eventually, the posters came out on the wall, on telephone poles and things, saying that we had to be here in the Assembly Center at Merced by the 13th of May of 1942. And that was in April of 1942 that this notice came out. So there was very little time in between the notice and the time we had to be in the camp.
For decades, the stories of what happened to Japanese Americans and immigrants as a result of Executive Order 9066 have been kept inside by the people that lived through the nightmare. For some, the pain of sharing the truth with even their own children was too great. But time can be a great equalizer between pain and truth, and when that balance is found, lessons can be learned.
Well, it sort of came gradually, you know. All these things were happening. First, you're restricted to 5 miles of travel. You can't go further than 5 miles. And you had to get a special permit in order to go further.
We were gathering Japanese magazines and pictures and anything Japanese, phonograph records, and we start to burn them or bury them, which was telling me that it was dangerous to be identified as a Japanese.
There was actually shots fired at the house. You know, bullets went through the house, kind of, you know, my dad said he remembers everyone having to duck down on the floor and such because they didn't know if they were going to keep shooting or it was just one random shot.
On March 29, 1942, Public Proclamation No. 4 made it illegal for all Japanese to voluntarily leave the military zones. The writing was now literally on the wall. Japanese Americans learned of their fate by public notices, posters, articles in local newspapers like the Fresno Bee, and newsreels.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
They expected to know from the media, plus there were placards, announcements, you know, about the fact that you were supposed to be aware of Executive Order 9066. So there was this kind of, let's say, broad dissemination of information for the Japanese. And in the Fresno area, there would be 2 assembly centers that would be devised for the Japanese. One was the Fresno Fairgrounds, and the other place was Pinedale, which at this time in the 1940s was somewhat distant from the central city of Fresno.
2 other assembly centers were created in California's central San Joaquin Valley, one in Merced at the Merced County Fairgrounds and another south of Fresno in the small farming town of Tulare. Fairgrounds made the most sense to the military for temporarily housing the Japanese population, while the more permanent war relocation centers were built in the interior of the country. For Saburo, only 12 years old in the spring of 1942, news of orders to imprison all people of Japanese ancestry meant the quiet, small-town life he knew and loved would be taken away.
What I remember was that we were all going to be leaving home, and the army or government was going to be requiring us to leave. And so I remember walking a mile and a half to my elementary school before school started and asking the principal, who was my teacher in my 6th grade class, to give me my war stamps and war bonds that we were buying to support the war. And she didn't say a word. And I remember walking out, looking through the school and seeing some kids playing and never able to say goodbye to any of my classmates.
For many Japanese on the West Coast, the orders to report to assembly centers came with little warning. Once the decision to open assembly centers in Fresno and Pinedale was made, families had just days to sell off their possessions since each person could only bring 1 bag or trunk. If they farmed, they had little time to make arrangements or plan how to care for their land. No one knew how long they would be gone, or if they'd ever see their homes and belongings again. Kiyo Saito had just graduated high school near Sacramento, California, when the orders to report to assembly centers was given by the military. Many of the Japanese from this area were sent down to the Pinedale Assembly Center near Fresno. She remembers the stark shift in feelings towards the Japanese and how her family dealt with the pain and fear of leaving their lives behind.
I read this book by Grodzins, Americans Betrayed, and learned about all these organizations, Farm Bureau, Native Sons and Daughters of the Golden West, American Legion, VFW, they were all against us. They were all pushing for concentration camps. In those days, you know, that was what they called it, concentration camps, not relocation centers, you know. Yeah. Then this poster, you know, this big posters of how big are they? They were all nailed onto fence posts and buildings and telephone poles and everywhere. I tell you, when I first saw that, I said, that's me. Notice to all those of Japanese ancestry. Imagine, you know, I think back on it now and I think, did my country do something like that? I was the oldest I had 6 brothers and 2 sisters. And I was responsible for getting them ready to go. But you know what was so interesting is that my parents never would talk about all this in the presence of my brothers and sisters. My mother said children need to grow up snow, meaning happy and secure. So we never talked about it until they were all bedded down, and then the 3 of us would make plans.
Legally, country-wise, politically, I didn't think things like that could happen.
For Ruth Katsura and Midori Tani, Growing up not far from the Fresno Fairgrounds made the experience of being forced to move into animal stalls there a memory that will never fade.
I'm going to be real free about my age because I was at Fresno State. And right after we got to Assembly Center, I would turn 20.
Yeah,
so,
you're still young too.
You know, we could talk about the Assembly Center, right? You know, we're there now. That short period when we had the shock and thing, we had to come back to reality. We're really confined, you know.
Did you live in the barracks when you were at the Assembly Center? Did you?
Yeah, that's where I learned all the term: latrine, barracks, mess hall. So we spoke the language.
For years, the Fresno Fairgrounds have come to life each October, attracting large crowds enjoying the sights and sounds of the big Fresno Fair. Today, most of the thousands that visit the fair have no idea that this was a concentration camp during World War II, imprisoning over 5,000 Japanese Americans and immigrants after the Pearl Harbor attack. By May of 1942, wooden barracks guarded by gun towers filled the interior racetrack parking lot. The stalls, still used today for livestock, held a population of mostly American citizens who couldn't believe this was happening.
It was quite sobering, obviously, to come into a county fairground with basically your most personal belongings that you could only carry and fit into your duffel bag. My dad remembers taking in his mitt, and my Uncle Johnny his mitt and his baseball equipment, a football that was deflated. And even I remember when there was the Fresno Assembly Center dedication. My dad was 88 at the time. As we were walking by the animal stalls, he pointed directly to an area and said that this is where we used to live.
When the truck came, I don't remember any details other than this family coming to say goodbye to my sisters. And we got in the truck, and all I remember is that as the truck came into Fresno, I could see all the banners stretched across the streets announcing the West Coast Relays. When it arrived at the Fresno Fairgrounds, all I remember is that when we got off, we were given large bags to fill with straw or hay, I don't know which it was, which turned out to be our mattress for that night.
From where my birthplace, I could open the window and I could hear that thing. I lived right there. I lived on Willow and Kings Canyon. I could walk to the fairgrounds.
Bewildered, confused, some angry, people that for years had enjoyed the Fresno Fair with their friends and family were now prisoners inside of it. The Assembly Center in Fresno, like the ones in nearby Pinedale, Merced, and Tulare, was hastily constructed, substandard housing. Families were kept together in one large room with cots. Meals were taken in a central mess hall for each block of barracks, and makeshift classrooms were set up for the children. Of the nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans and immigrants forced into detention, well over half were under the age of 14.
I really think that when you look at the camps in general, it really disrupted the family life for all Japanese Americans. They could never have a sit-down meal, which is very precious in our family, and yet they had to wait in line, go into a mess hall. Most of the parents would sit together, the kids would sit together separately, so it totally disrupted the whole dynamics of a family dinner together. Not to mention the inconveniences of having to take a shower in a public, take a public shower and not have any privacy, or imagine to have to do your business on toilets with no partitions. I remember a close family friend, Nori Masuda, telling me that his sister, Rosie, was so ashamed and didn't want to have her privacy interrupted when she did her business that she would go into the women's bathroom at 3 in the morning. And most of the other women finally caught on. That's the only way that you can have any privacy. So she would go in there and there would be still a lot of women and many develop problems, digestive problems, because they would hold it so long that it would really imbalance their digestive system. But Rosie, in one particular moment, she went 3 in the morning to use the bathroom, and there was a bunch of women there. So the next time she went, she took in a paper bag, and as she sat on the toilet, she put the bag over her head, and that way she felt that this would be the only way she would have any privacy.
The first night, I remember the military police came and knocked on our barrack door, and we all had to be in our beds because they would flash the flashlight in our faces to make sure all 9 of us was in our barrack. And I remember people scurrying to their barrack because of this bed check that was going on. And I know that we were thinking about the people who had to go to the bathroom or couldn't go to the bathroom because they had to be in their bed. And I remember there was a searchlight from the bleachers that scanned our barracks to make sure that nobody was up and around after the 10 o'clock.
10 miles from the Fresno Fairgrounds Assembly Center, the Pinedale Assembly Center was ready to receive its first detainees on May 7, 1942. Previously a lumber mill and storage site for agricultural crops like cotton, the massive camp was constructed with 10 blocks, each with 26 buildings, along with structures for administration and military police. Publicly, the military put a much different spin on what they called the evacuation. While many of these Americans accepted what was happening, the conditions and programs were not as shown in this 1942 film.
Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort.
The government called the Japanese Americans sent to the assembly centers evacuees, even though they were forcibly removed from their homes and made prisoners. Most of the 4,700 people that came to Pinedale were from Washington, Oregon, or, like Kyo Sato, from Sacramento, California.
On the day of evacuation, my father would take our blankets and spread it out in the living room floor. And then he started hiding things. And I watched and was a little bit fearful because searches were so stringent, you know. But my father had carefully selected all the things that he thought he had to take. And all the 30 years or more that I have been talking to students, none of them ever guessed what they were. Hammer, nails, roll of wire, a gallon jug, a bucket. My goodness, I mean, who would think of taking a bucket? And every single thing that my father hid was so necessary. Everybody borrowed it. He shared his nails. You know, just think, you're in an empty barracks room. Nothing is there. No place to hang things. Just you have a cot to sleep on, you know. And then you give them a nail and a hammer, and you hang your clothes. You hang your wet towels. You know, a place to do things like that. Little things like that bring so much, what is it, hope, you know?
In total, 13 of the 17 assembly centers built in the West were in California. Like Fresno and Tulare, the Merced County Fairgrounds was selected as the site for the Merced Assembly Center. 4,669 people of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated here between May and September of 1942. Over 200 tar paper barracks were built to house families, along with 11 mess halls, 40 shower areas, and 30 buildings for toilets. 160 soldiers guarded the prisoners whose only crime was having Japanese DNA in their veins. But that didn't change the spirit of patriotism for many who were wrongfully incarcerated here. For detainees like Sherman Kishi, loyalty to America wasn't diminished in spite of wrongful imprisonment.
I was 16 years old in 1942, but on the day that we came into the Assembly Center, it was my 17th birthday, May the 13th, 1942. There were blocks that were established, and we were in Block A, and I had a friend that was the manager of block, the so-called manager of Block A, and he accepted me as his runner at that age, and so I took a lot of censuses and things within the camp itself during that period of time, but that didn't take that much time. The rest of the time we just didn't do a heck of a lot. We had friends here that we were together with, and so we just spent time just fooling around basically, although we did play baseball. There was baseball that happened right here where this grandstand is. It was a wooden grandstand at that time, and they formed a baseball field right out front of it, and we did play there. They also had talent shows there, and one of the favorite was a young lady from Walnut Grove that was a good singer, and she would sing God Bless America. No, it was God Bless America she sang, and that was one of the favorites that was sung during the talent show.
Well, I'm not that familiar with the Merced Relocation Center. My father didn't like to talk about that very much. His impression was, yeah, we stayed in stables and it was really bad. It was cold, we didn't have food, food was bad. They weren't able to bring anything that they needed because they were allowed just 2 bags. It was pretty tough. I mean, he wasn't happy there. It's funny because there's people I know in the community from Merced, they remember walking up to the fence and trying to trade with the Japanese young people because, they were behind jail. So he'd trade them this and that, and he'd get this, they do trading and bartering. And actually, some of the guys that he went to school with from the Merced area were actually in that camp. And it's just really funny because his perspective on that. He said, yeah, they were there and we got to go, I'd go see him every day and we'd talk and try to play between the wire until the guards came by.
By the summer of 1942, the assembly centers on the West Coast were full. The majority of the Japanese American population in these camps settled in for the long haul and made the best of a bad situation. Beyond the barbed wire, most of America was still in favor of locking up those of Japanese ancestry. World War II and the battle in the Pacific were raging as the United States pushed closer to Japan. But not everyone was in favor of what was happening to Japanese Americans in the summer of 1942. Mine Matsumoto grew up in Clovis, California, and her family was loved and respected in this small town with strong Western roots and a cowboy way of life. Mine was a senior at Clovis High School when Executive Order 9066 was signed, and the subsequent curfew placed on all people of Japanese descent meant that Mine, a girl that had grown up in the Clovis school system, couldn't be a part of an important ceremony no teenager should miss.
We didn't go to the graduation ceremony. We had our own graduation in the principal's office. Well, you know, the Japanese people have this saying, shikata ga nai, that means you can't help it. That's how we were raised. I'm sure I was very hurt because I was making my dress for the graduation. We didn't graduate in caps and gowns. But as I say, you know, it just couldn't be helped.
Not long after the quiet graduation in the principal's office, it was time for Japanese American families of Clovis to leave for the War Relocation Center at Poston, Arizona. Unlike the Japanese in Fresno or Merced, people of Japanese ancestry in Clovis didn't report to an assembly center. They boarded a train headed straight for the desert prison that would now be their home. But unlike the sentiment found in most of the United States towards Japanese Americans, the people of Clovis made it known how they felt about the injustice of internment.
The church ladies from the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church had punch and cookies for us. And there were two girls, they were like sophomores, Betty Pendergrass and Cassie Wheeler. And they were there saying goodbye to all their friends, and both of them were just, we weren't crying, we might have been crying, but they were just crying and saying goodbye to all the friends. And I know that there were other people there saying goodbye to us. They gave us all a letter from the community. It just said how sorry they were that we were leaving and that they'll wait for us to come back. But I remember my dad telling us, don't ever expect to come back to California.
Pinedale was so totally different, you know. I still remember so clearly walking through that gate. And there were guard towers with two guards and a machine gun at each guard tower. And as we went through there, you know, I was holding, all crowds of people had gotten off the bus. And we were all going through there, and I'd look up, try to glance up to see what they were doing up there, and I thought, there they were, guarding these dangerous criminals down below.
Keo, her family, and the remaining 4,700 detainees in Pinedale would stay here for 2 months. In most cases, the assembly centers were only occupied for a short time, while construction on the 10 more permanent relocation camps was completed. Disorganization, poor decision-making, and war hysteria led to the military's rush to imprison 120,000 innocent people into these temporary fairground prisons instead of waiting just a few more months for the main camps to be ready.
Imagine creating 15 temporary holding camps because our permanent concentration camps weren't finished. Can you imagine going to all that? No? And then building these other 10 other permanent camps.
In Tulare, California, 45 miles south of Fresno, the assembly center here housed 4,800 Japanese Americans and immigrants from Southern California and the nearby California coast. In September of 1942, the population of the Tulare Assembly Center was sent to the war relocation camp in Gila River, Arizona, a hot, sprawling place in the desert south of Phoenix. For a short time after, the Tulare Fairgrounds site was used as a military training area, then converted into a Nazi prisoner of war camp until 1946. Between December 11, 1944 and January 24, 1946, 245 Nazi prisoners were kept here and worked agricultural jobs on nearby farms. As summer came to an end in California's San Joaquin Valley in 1942, the War Relocation Authority was completing construction of the 10 permanent relocation centers in the United States. The government used terms like evacuation and relocation to publicly describe what was happening to these Americans.
I have a lot of opinion about the terminology that the government used. I tell in our presentation students that when the Oroville Dam was in danger of breaking, people were evacuated and they were relocated to a safe place. We were not evacuated, we were not relocated. We were incarcerated, we were being imprisoned, and we were transferred to a permanent concentration camp.
Just as families were settling in and learning to deal with life inside the assembly centers, they had to face yet another severe blow. With construction complete on the permanent sites by the WRA, internees were abruptly gathered up, put onto trains, and sent to one of 10 relocation centers across the country, prolonging the misery of wrongful imprisonment and the uncertainty of what would be left of their lives, when and if this would ever end.
And I always remember the story that my mother shared with me, that she was sitting next to her mother and my grandmother on the train that had blinders on both sides. So she pulled the blinder up a little bit so she could take a peek out at the bottom of the train window, and she could see these signs from the local racists and bigots saying, get out of California, never come back to Fresno. And so my mother asked her mom, Mom, what's going to happen to us? They had to take a 4-day train ride to Jerome, Arkansas. And on the way, she was very scared. She didn't know what was going to happen. She was, are we going to have to go through what the Jewish people have to go through in Germany? And she goes, no. She goes, this is the greatest country in the world. All immigrants have to pay a price. This is the price that we have to pay as Japanese Americans. So we'll go to these camps, we'll prove how loyal we are, and we'll come back home.
It was a terrible trip. It took a long time. It was hot in the cars. They were old cars, and they closed all the blinds on us so that we couldn't look out. So it was not a pleasant trip. The babies were crying, and it was uncomfortable all the way there.
I remember this train ride
to Jerome,
and I remember we had to pull down the shades whenever we entered a town area where people lived.
I know we couldn't peek out.
No, we couldn't.
But I saw Calexico.
And then when you had to make a pit stop, they'd stop out in the middle of no place, and we'd find a bush somewhere and go.
From the camp?
Traveling from Assembly Center to Jerome.
Didn't they have the bathroom they call a latrine?
I don't remember a bathroom.
In the train?
Maybe they did. I don't remember it.
Oh, with the children must have been horrible.
I don't remember a bathroom.
I couldn't have held there for 2 days.
Oh, no, they'd stop out in the middle of no place.
By December of 1942, the War Relocation Authority had done its job, removed nearly 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans out of the West Coast and imprisoned them into 10 camps in California, Arizona, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and Arkansas. For the United States of America, fear had become stronger than justice. The wrongful incarceration of thousands of legal U.S. citizens had become the largest violation of civil liberties in our nation's history. The camps were largely constructed from the same set of plans: tar paper-sided barracks set in groups of blocks with mess halls, community toilets and showers, a hospital, administration buildings, and headquarters for military police. All were surrounded with watchtowers, barbed wire, and heavily armed guards. Today, at most of the 10 relocation prison sites, little remains. Wind and time have erased most of the physical markers of this dark time in American history. Ghostly remains of buildings are all that's left to prove that this really happened in our history. But there is one relocation camp that was preserved to honor the memory of all who suffered.
Well, I think one of the things that's important about remembering what happened during World War II to Japanese Americans is that 2/3 of the 120,000 people that were confined during World War II were American citizens. And for me, at the end of the day, Manzanar is really about the fragility of our constitutional rights. If it could happen to Japanese Americans in 1942, it could happen to any of us. So one of the things that makes Manzanar special is that it was the first site that was included in the national park system. So as a National Historic Site, it represents the experiences of incarcerated Japanese Americans during World War II. But one of the things that was important when the site was created in 1992 was that there really was no development here. There were remnant foundations for the barracks. There were concrete slabs where buildings had existed. And the building behind us, the auditorium, was still intact, as were two rock sentry posts at the historic entrance and the cemetery monument at the west end of the camp. One of the things that stakeholders told us was that they really wanted us to create some buildings so that there could be a sense of what the living conditions were like. So we'll be seeing some of the reconstructed barracks. Those barracks are constructed on the same location that the original barracks were constructed on. In December, we finished the construction of a women's latrine building on the concrete pad that it originally existed on. That building really provides for a very provocative experience for visitors, because when you see that building, it shows the humiliation that people endured and the lack of privacy that many people were uncomfortable with, rightly so.
In 1943, life within the camps had become established, and in the true spirit of Gaman, prisoners had adapted to make the best of it. Various sports were a major coping mechanism for internees, but camp baseball leagues held a deeper connection to Japanese Americans forced behind barbed wire.
When I talk about baseball, Japanese American baseball, or the Nisei leagues, I really like to back up to 1872 when Horace Wilson, a school teacher from San Francisco, introduced baseball into Japan at a Kaisei Gakko, which was a grade school. So when the Issei came from Japan to America at the turn of the century, they already had knowledge of baseball. So when the Issei's kids, the Nisei generation, the first generation born here, they tremendously supported their kids playing the game. There was a quote by a local valley guy, Takeo Suo. He said, putting on a baseball uniform was like putting on the American flag. And as much research and as a historian in baseball and in general, I think it went further than that. I think not only did Japanese Americans want to prove how American they were by playing the game at its highest level, they wanted to show all the other immigrants that they were the best at playing it.
Even before the war, Nisei Baseball League pioneers Kenichi Zenimura and Carey's uncle Johnny Nakagawa had earned enough respect within the game that baseball greats Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig came to Fresno to play an exhibition game in 1927. The Nisei were on Gehrig's team and beat Babe Ruth's team 13-3. But playing America's pastime wasn't enough to prove one's loyalty to the United States in a Japanese internment camp in 1943. The War Relocation Authority created a bureaucratic way of testing the loyalty of all adults and teens in the WRA camps. The first test of loyalty form was aimed at all draft-aged Nisei males. The last two questions, number 27 and 28, where a yes answer proved unwavering loyalty to the United States, created a firestorm of confusion and resentment. That confusion led to some detainees answering no to both questions, and created a term that would dramatically impact those who it was used to describe: the No-No Boys.
The No-No Boys came from their answering of question number 27, which was, are you willing to serve in the military? And 28 it is a question as to whether you forswear allegiance to Japan and reaffirm your allegiance to this country. And a lot of people didn't know how to answer that question. Like my father, he was born here, had American citizenship. He had no allegiance to Japan to forswear, and then he is loyal to this country, but how do you answer it if you never had a loyalty to Japan to start with? And so he puts, I don't know. And then he scratches it out and puts yes on there, but the damage had already been done.
No-No Boys were denied early clearance from the camps in 1943, as the WRA began to allow internees who passed the loyalty questionnaire to leave the relocation centers early, as long as they didn't go back to the West Coast. In some cases, No-No Boys were separated from their families and sent to the relocation camp at Tule Lake, California, a place where the government detained Japanese Americans they feared could be troublesome. After denying his early leave clearance request on the no-no basis, Robert's father, Masato Shintaku, was sent a new form to fill out again.
And they wanted him to reaffirm his loyalty to this country. And he refused. He refused on the grounds that he's an American citizen and only people of Japanese ancestry were required to answer this question. And what he told them was, if every American over the age of 18 was required to answer this question, he'd gladly answer it. But they were being prejudicial in the way that they did this. Therefore, he didn't feel that he should have to answer it if every other American didn't have to answer it.
Prior to the war, Masato was a successful businessman with a thriving grocery store in Salinas, California. He and his family were proud to be Americans.
After President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, then he decided he needed to close the store. And so they closed the store, and anyway, when he was in camp, then he lost everything.
Stories of loss for the nearly 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans during relocation were many. Homes and farms were no longer there when they returned from camp. Racism was still rampant for Japanese families returning to their communities. But the loss of a child sent to war is always the most difficult to overcome. And at a time where Japanese Americans wrongfully incarcerated had every reason to resist their country and their government, one of the greatest stories of World War II was born. Early in 1943, as the war raged in the Pacific and in Europe, the need for more men to join the fight was real. Despite martial law in Hawaii and mainland Japanese American men being sent to internment camps, their desire to fight for their country never waned, and many answered the call when they had every reason not to. On February 1, 1943, the U.S. government reversed its decision banning Japanese Americans from serving in the armed forces, and the 442nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team was created, made up almost entirely of Japanese American men from Hawaii and the West Coast.
Important and decisive battles. And each time, these men of the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Combat Team have been right out in front. At the same time, these men are also aware of the great prejudice against them because of the war in the Pacific. They know that there are people back home who make no distinction between them and the Japs we have fought at Tarawa, at Saipan, and the Philippines. And that's why these men originally volunteered, and why for 11 long months now, they've been in continuous combat. They've wanted to prove to other Americans how wrong it is to judge a man by the pigment of his skin or the shape of his eyes.
The 442nd became a legendary fighting force in Europe, and in the ultimate definition of irony, an artillery battalion of the 442 liberated Jewish prisoners in a Nazi death camp, as their own families were being held in camps back home by the government they were fighting for. After World War II had come to an end, the 442nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of American warfare. "75 years after Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Roosevelt, Saburo and his wife Marion are on a journey to break the silence that has shrouded this chapter in American history. Marion and Saburo met and were married after the war had ended, but like many Nisei, shared a painful past.
I remember the music. There was a radio program called the Hit Parade, and they always used to play the top 10 hits of the week, and week after week the same song would be popular. And I believe one of the songs that hit the Hit Parade was "Don't Fence Me In." Oh, give me land, lots of land, under starry skies above.
Don't fence me in.
I was gazing out the window when this song was playing, and this song came on, the Hit Parade, and I'm looking out the window, and I'm in prison, and I said, boy, what I would give to be out of here. I'll work so hard just to be free.
The silence many Japanese Americans held for decades after the war wasn't always about the relocation itself. There were dark days and nights inside the barbed wire of the camps, and too many times the crimes of men went unreported and left generations of suffering.
There were girls being raped and there was girls getting pregnant, but you'll never hear these stories because of the shame involved in our culture. We don't bring shame upon our family and our community, so this was kept under hush-hush and nobody spoke about it. I tell my story of being molested, not raped, but molested by an East Bay man. I was just 10 years old and sleeping. My sister and I were invited to spend a night with a friend, her friend, my sister's friend, and these beds were all side by side, and this man, he just leaned over his wife and just did what he did, and just traumatized me, and I couldn't scream, I was just, nothing would come out of my mouth. I was so traumatized. I saw his face before me for many, many years. Matter of fact, it was at the Tule Lake pilgrimage that all of a sudden I didn't see his face anymore. And that was, I attribute that to my being able to share my pain. I was able to tell people what happened to me, and so it was not festering within my body anymore. It was out there. So now that it was out there, it didn't. I didn't see his face anymore, and that was a miracle.
The indignities of life in the prison camps sometimes continued even in death. The sheer lack of human compassion from those running the war relocation centers at times was staggering.
My grandmother passes away they knew that even at the Little Rock Hospital she wasn't going to make it, so they sent her back to Jerome to be with her family. And she passed away in the camp at Jerome, Arkansas. And it was, we have a photo of her coffin and all the internees. Well, in our culture, in the Buddhist culture, with most Japanese Americans, we cremate, our loved ones. And so they didn't have a cemetery in Little Rock, Arkansas, so they sent her body to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And about 2 months later, in a Folgers coffee can, to her barrack, comes her mother's ashes. And so my mom lifted up the lid of the Folgers coffee can, and on top of her mother's ashes was a piece of paper. So she thought it was her name, and so she opened up the paper, and all there was on the paper was the words "Jap woman." And it really crushed my mom to see her mother being reduced to this label. But at the same time, what came flooding back to my mom was this wonderful speech from my grandmother when they were going to Arkansas, that this is the greatest country in the world, all immigrants have to pay a price, we'll prove how loyal we are and come back. And her mother, the inhumanities of her death didn't even stop there. I mean, they had to label her with this racist label of just being a Jap woman.
On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allied forces and the war in Europe ended. But Japan remained defiant to surrender, even after the United States promised prompt and utter destruction if they did not agree to the terms of the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945. Japan ignored the ultimatum. "11 days later, America made good on its word. At 8:15 in the morning, the United States Air Force B-29 bomber Enola Gay released a bomb codenamed the Little Boy, containing 141 pounds of uranium. It took 44 seconds for Little Boy to fall from the release altitude of 31,000 feet to its detonation point 2,000 feet above the city of Hiroshima, Japan.
I think from a general standpoint, a lot of Japanese Americans in Nikkei here in this valley are very skeptical and in wonderment of why Hiroshima was chosen for the bomb site, knowing that so many Japanese Americans from this valley roots are from Hiroshima, not just California, but Oregon and Washington as well. So that's one aspect that, I always wondered why the military and why our government chose, Hiroshima. So I really feel that the Nisei must have been at the crossroads of emotions to have to deal with having to see Hiroshima absolutely incinerated, knowing that their friends, their family members, cousins were still part of that devastation of the atomic bomb blast.
3 days later, after Japan again refused surrender, the U.S. B-29 bomber Boxcar released a plutonium bomb codenamed Fat Man over the skies of Nagasaki, Japan. The bomb detonated 1,600 feet above the city, creating a 2-mile-wide, 4,000-degree fireball with 600-mile-per-hour winds, vaporizing the city center. The bombings killed 130,000 people, most civilians. They remain the only use of nuclear weapons in the history of warfare. After World War II ended and the camps began to close, life for Japanese Americans returning home wasn't easy.
See, my dad never did recover financially. We went to Texas with nothing. We moved from San Benito to Uvalde, Texas. I remember like in April of '56, the total income we had, because I remember hearing my parents talk, the total income we made in April of '56 was $10. There were a family of 8 then, 8 of us. I don't know how they made it.
There was city councils said that they didn't want Japanese back. Most of the city councils did. That included, I think, Atwater and Livingston and Turlock.
We went to a grocery store one time, and my poor father, there was a white guy that came in and just gave him a hard time, cussing him out. After we got home, yeah. And I wanted to get some groceries, but my father said, we better go. So he shuffled us out and we all left.
Creates a lot of anger. I was very angry about all this. But the interesting thing about it is my father, he really didn't like that type of attitude. He was very animate about me well, it didn't happen to you. You have nothing to do with this. You shouldn't be angry. He says, it happened to my generation. And we got over it and we put it behind us. He says, you can't dwell in the past. These are the kind of things that set you back.
As the years passed, life for the thousands wrongfully imprisoned moved on. The Nisei generation began to have children of their own. The work of groups like the JACL pressed on. In Central California, new organizations were formed, like the Nisei Farmers League, protecting the rights and properties of Japanese American growers. But through all this progress, a silence about what had happened during the war remained. Stories of the incarceration experience were not openly shared within the Japanese community or even within families.
And I'd never been able to get any information out of my dad.
Did you try?
I did. I remember.
It's okay. How old were you when you started trying?
In my 20s.
Why is it hard for you right now? What's hurting you inside right now? Knowing what your dad went through?
Yeah, but see, I think I asked him twice. And both times, I got the only answer I got was a very pained look. So the second time, I realized it's not a question I should be asking.
The legal aspects to what happened in 1942 to Japanese Americans were challenged almost immediately by people like Fred Korematsu, who took his argument that incarceration was unconstitutional all the way to the Supreme Court. But it took 46 years for the United States government to finally do the right thing. A U.S. District Court in California vacated Korematsu's conviction in 1984, and then, in 1988, Congress passed and President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which led to an official apology from the United States to Japanese Americans and immigrants that were imprisoned during World War II.
We learned some lessons from history. We do not want them to be repeated. Those lessons resonate today after the attacks on September 11, 2001, and in the current discussions and debate in this nation over immigration, over the war on terrorism, and how to deal with immigrants. It becomes vitally important that we remember those lessons we should learn from the internment of Japanese American and apply those principles today.
For many Japanese Americans, the Civil Liberties Act lifted the weight of shame that hung on the experiences of their incarceration. That shame, which caused generations of silence about what happened, began to fade away, and with it, the stories of pain, survival, hope, and forgiveness began to emerge. For Saburo and Marian Masada, speaking publicly across the country about their experiences has helped them make peace with the pain, while educating those who have never truly heard this story.
The anti-Japanese factions.
But now, they are on a journey that has literally taken a lifetime to complete. This is McGee, a small town in southeastern Arkansas close to the site of the Jerome Relocation Center Saburo was sent to as a boy. It's a typical small farming town in America's heartland, but with a strong connection to the Japanese American experience of World War II. At the train depot in McGee, a museum preserving the history of the Jerome and Rohr relocation camps nearby holds a remarkable collection of photographs, documents, artwork, and personal effects of those confined in both camps. Most of the people sent here, like Saburo, were from Fresno and California's Central Valley.
This is Block 43, that's where we were. The Hawaiians were in this block, and they came barefooted. They didn't realize that Arkansas was not Hawaii.
At the time of internment, 17,000 people of Japanese ancestry were held in the Jerome and Rohr camps. The camp at Jerome, where Saburo and his family first came after leaving the Fresno Fairgrounds Assembly Center, was converted into a Nazi POW camp in June of 1944. The nearly 8,000 living here had to pack up their belongings and move once again to either the nearby camp at Rohr or back to Arizona to the Gila River Relocation Center south of Phoenix. Collections like this tell the stories of the incarceration in very personal ways. From artwork made during confinement to images that document the struggle and hope to overcome life behind barbed wire. As Saburo and Marion discover, a single photograph is like a time machine, taking us back to moments that never really fade from our minds. Here, a photo hangs on the wall, taken the day after Saburo's father's funeral, who died in the Jerome camp not long after arriving from Fresno.
See, Marion, this is a picture of my father's funeral. It turned extremely cold when we arrived, and 21 days after we arrived, I think it was snowing too, but he caught pneumonia, and he died. And the day he died, the potbelly wood stove showed up in our barrack. My mother and her 7 children, right there behind the casket. All those flowers were artificial flowers made by the camp people. This is Block 43, where our barrack was. There were 7 of us and my mother.
A few miles south of town, past sprawling soy and cotton fields, a 2-lane to country road leads to the site of the Jerome Relocation Camp, where Saburo and his family were imprisoned. The drive here begins to unlock memories buried for a lifetime.
I do remember it got real cold. And I remember the first meal we had, and in fact it's the only meal I remember eating all 3 years. Breakfast, lunch, supper. The only meal I remember was the first supper we had when we arrived, and it was mutton stew. And I could still see the yellow grease floating on top. And all of us got diarrhea. And so I'll never forget mutton stew. But I do recall when I asked Mr. Ellington, who bought the farm, or who bought the site for his farm, and I said, what'd they do with all the barracks? They must have given it to the poor people around here who were envious of the fact that we had running water and electricity. And he laughed. He said, oh, no. The barracks are so shabbily built that we just had a bulldozer dig a deep hole, and we just pushed all the barracks into the hole and covered it up. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's like my history was being buried. And although it's not a history that I wanted to have, but the feeling was, gosh, my history was all buried. It's all there underground.
Today, at the site of the Jerome Relocation Camp, a monument stands in a farmer's field memorializing what happened here long ago. For those who experienced incarceration at Jerome, this is a sacred place to remember the past and pay respect to those, like Saburo's father, that never made it home.
Lord, bless this memorial and help people to know that this should never happen again. Bob, sorry about your being here, and you died away from home. And we're sorry that we didn't get to celebrate and grieve your life like we would have if we were back in Fresno. But thank you for your sacrifice and all that you did for our family. Amen.
Amen.
In June of 1944, as Jerome was converted into a German POW camp, this rare color film footage captured the closing of the Jerome camp. It also captured images of a tall brick smokestack that vented the boiler in Jerome's hospital building. Today, that smokestack still stands in a field near the memorial, a sobering reminder of what happened here, and a beacon for those searching for a way to heal and move on.
I told John Ellington, can they, will he preserve it? He said, sure, we'll save it. So fortunate they didn't knock it down.
Yeah, isn't that something? This is the last piece of evidence that there was a camp here.
We can't just forget about it. We can't just, I don't believe in being angry about it because that doesn't solve the problems. We want to move ahead. We want to be sure, like my father said, I don't want anybody rich or famous. I only want 9 good citizens. And that's what we work towards, all of us, And for our young kids, if our young kids don't know, they're going to repeat the thing again. See, we don't want it repeated, and it's getting dangerous right now. 75 years later, I'm beginning to feel more and more that we need to be vigilant. We need to teach our young children.
20 miles north of Jerome, Arkansas, a small cemetery stands at the site of the Rohr relocation camp, where Sabuto remained until the war was over. In addition to the 23 graves of people that died while imprisoned here between 1943 and 1945, this small grove of trees between cotton fields memorializes the men of the 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Unit.
This monument we like because it tells about our immigrant parents who were here for almost over 50 years until they were finally permitted to become American citizens. But it's their courage and their vision that made it possible for us to be here in America and to be able to survive what we had to go through during World War II by their spirit of loyalty and devotion to our country.
Just standing here, all the pains and struggles and difficulties that we as the children suffered. I was molested in camp by Nisei, and it traumatized me so much, and it confused my image of what a man was. And when I married you, you had a hard time at first, and I struggled for 8 years trying to work things out for myself. But it's been a long struggle, but still it was your love and your love that kept me going. And even though sometimes I felt like leaving the marriage sometimes, it's just a feeling that I had. Mm-hmm. But I always looked at you And I always said, but he loves me. And so that's what kept me going. And look at us, we're married 61 years and we're able to make this trip. It's so special. It's so special. And we're just two little country bumpkins. You're from Little Carruthers and I'm from Little Salinas, and we're not important people by any. We're not judges or lawyers or doctors or famous people, but we identify, you and I, with the common people. And we're survivors. We survived it. And if the young people see that we have survived the hatred and being spit upon and called names and being treated like nobody, we can survive. And this is to encourage and help the future generations that if they hang in there, gaman, and not bring shame on their families, they can make it and come out strong and give tribute to all these lives that have gone before us.
Time can be unforgiving. The places where lives were changed remain. But one day, only the ghosts of those who suffered will whisper in the winds here. The stories of those who lived through the incarceration must go on. Honoring what happened, no matter how painful, is the only way to heal and prevent this kind of injustice from happening again. The Japanese-American experience of World War II left a scar on generations and in the soul of a nation. History is a journey never completely behind us. It can light the path we walk tomorrow.
Funding for Silent Sacrifice was made possible by grants from Japanese American Confinement Sites Program of the National Park Service and California Civil Liberties Public Education Program. Major production funding provided by the Larry and Alice Kitahara Foundation, Nisei Farmers League, Sun-Made Growers of California.
It's a wonderful feeling to be a raisin grower because that's what I grew up with. For our family, Sun-Made provided a very safe haven to market our raisins after the war. I will be a Sun-Made member until the day I die.
As well as through the generous support of these individual and business donors. Thank you.